All right, so this is the last Roman numeral 2 fungi of our chapter 16 lecture. So the last part of the lecture, part 3. So fungi, how are fungi different than plants? Fungi have their own kingdom, okay? They're not plants, they're not animals. They're very different organisms. So number 1, they're eukaryotic. This is coming from your outline. Number 2, they're multicellular. I have most in parentheses here because there is a subgroup of fungi called yeast, right? Yeast are unicellular. They're only made of one cell. So that's the exception. But in terms of all the fleshy fungus that you can see in the world, the fungi that we eat, you know, the mushrooms that we eat, and the mold that we see everywhere sometimes, mold is also fungi that are multicellular. So mold is multicellular. Those big mushrooms are multicellular, but yeast are the only unicellular fungi, okay? Number 3, this is the sort of big divide. Nutrition, they are heterotrophs, just like we are. So they have to absorb the nutrients outside their body, right? The absorption of outside nutrients. So they do it a couple ways. They can break things down. So if you're a mold or a mushroom, you're able to dissolve nutrients outside of your cells and then kind of suck up or bring in the dissolved or the broken down building blocks of those nutrients. Or if you're yeast, then those single celled can just bring in the nutrients from the outside. Anyways, so the words I have under nutrition is saprophyte. Saprophyte is an organism that can break down dead matter. And that's mostly what these fungi are. Most fungi are saprophytic. All right, that means that they grow predominantly on things that are dead already. And I think that makes sense to you if you think about where you see mushrooms or where you see mold. It's on something that's not thriving or living. However, some fungi are parasites. The difference between a parasite and a saprophyte is that parasites live on living organisms. So if you think about a parasitic worm, like a tapeworm, those infect living organisms and they kind of steal, food from living organisms. So predominantly fungi are saprophytes. Some of them can be parasites, okay? But the word, I have the 2 definitions there. Saprophytes are organisms that break down dead matter and parasites digest living things. All right, so let's take a look at the structure of our fungi. So what we see here is also reproduced in your notebook. The fungi that you think of, our mushrooms and our molds, are made of these rectangular cells. You can see how this is, these rectangles put back to back to back. Those individual cells are called hyphy, okay? So hyphy is going to be the name of this fungal cells. So in your mushrooms, right, the body of your mushroom, what's growing underground of the mushroom, that's the hyphae put together, that's the cells. And the structure of the fungi that live within the dirt or within the fruit or within the bread, like that's this part here that anchors the mushroom down. This is called the mycelium, okay, also made of the hyphae. And then the mushroom itself is actually the reproductive structure. So this grows above ground so that you can see it can make spores and it can disperse those spores in the wind to the outside. But the sort of everyday digesting away of a substrate, right, or the dead matter is going to be due to the mycelium. The mycelium is going to grow into a substance. So let's think about a dead tree in the forest. The mycelium will be eating away inside the bark and inside that tree. And then every once in a while you'll see a mushroom pop up, and the mushroom is just the reproductive structure to create spores, okay? So this is another image of a mycelium. So a mycelium just looks like a network of lines, like thread, right? Because each individual cell is tied back to back to back. Each individual cell, again, is called a hyphae, okay? So in your notes, you have hyphae is a rectangular cell of fungi, and mycelium is a collection of hyphae that form a mat below the surface. So don't call these roots because fungi don't have roots. They're not plants. Okay, it's a mycelium. This is another image of fungal mycelium. So you can see the network of branching hyphae. And then this is just that example of underground, you're going to have a network of mycelium. And this picture is great because it also shows you how the fungal mycelium are associating with the roots. Remember, this is called a mycorrhizae, and helping the plant here absorb nutrients. But then that one mycelium mat underground can actually pop up a mushroom here, and then a little bit further away can pop up a couple mushrooms here. So these two mushrooms are the same fungus. They're sort of, you can't see their connection underground. And then this is a great example of that process where a fairy ring, so this circle of mushrooms, this is all the same organism. So every single mushroom you see is just the reproductive portion that comes above ground, but really the working part of the fungus that's digesting away those organic matter is underground. All right, so let's take a look at the reproduction. So number one under letter C, reproduction, is spores. So mushrooms and molds reproduce by spores. If you look at one of those above ground mushrooms, you can see that we have these gills underneath, and these are where the spores are made. Okay, this is a nice SEM, scanning electron micrograph of spores. And then you can even make spore art. So for those of you who have little ones at home and maybe can't find anything for them to do, you can start to make spore prints. And this is actually a thing. So if you look it up, Google it, you'll see different ways of making some prints with fungal spores or mushroom spores. This is a really cool fungus. This is called a puffball mushroom, and it's this round ball that grows on the ground. And if you break it open, like you can see here, all this smoke, that's not smoke, that's the fungal spores leaving that inside. So the inside of this mushroom is just full of spores. And when you break it open, it comes out tiny, tiny things carried in the wind so it can grow more mushrooms elsewhere. Mold, right? So when you have moldy bread, you know that the bread, inside that bread, you have the mycelium of that mold, and the part of the mold that's on top on the surface, it looks fuzzy because you have little, these are small. I mean, you can see them with maybe a magnifying glass, but they come up like this and they form little stalks, and the spores are actually created inside of this region at the tip of their stalk, and releases the spore to the environment, okay? But your bread is getting eaten away from the inside by that mycelium, right? The mycelium absorbs nutrients, and the spores are for reproduction. All right, and again, this is reminding you, it's not roots, they're not plants, right? They're mycelium. So spores is the predominant way that mushrooms and mold reproduce, but how about yeast, right? Because yeast, they don't have mycelium. Oh, let me show you this image in just a second. They don't have mycelium. So yeast are different. Yeast are unicellular organisms, so they're just one cell big. When they reproduce, it's called budding. So budding is this process here and this process here, where you can see that there's an uneven split between the two cells, the parent cell here and the daughter cell here, that you start off unequal, but then they eventually, when they pinch off, they become bigger. So it's just a process. It's not mitosis. It's not binary fission that bacteria do. It's called budding. So I'm going to show you this really cool time-lapse photography of an orange and the mold completely destroying the orange. So when you saw that video, maybe you noticed the name of that mold, which caused Penicillium was the genus name. And that might seem a little familiar because we do have the medicine penicillin, which actually was derived from that mold, Penicillium. I'll talk about that in just a second, but let's move on to the roles, letter D, the roles of fungi in the environment. So fungi, first and foremost, are really important decomposers. They are super important. So when animals die, when plants die, how do their proteins get recycled, broken down, recycled into the earth for other organisms to use? And that's the job of fungi. So fungi are very important decomposers. Again, I said they're saprophytes predominantly, so they love to grow and on dead things and recycle their nutrients. So very, very important. They do have invasive hyphae, and they can be very, very destructive to wood or clothing. So if you think about fungi can grow on almost anything that's moist, right? So if you even got your textbook wet and you just let it sit there in the dark for a while, it'll start to get moldy because there's mold out there that can start to decompose that paper fiber, right, of your book. So they're very, very voracious decomposers. They can also be parasitic, right? So parasites, remember the definition is growing on living things, and parasites are never a good thing for the living organism, the host organism, because it ends up harming and making the host organism sick, and sometimes to the point of death. So 30% of fungi are parasitic. 50 species are known to be parasitic to humans and to animals. They can cause lots of infections, lung, skin, yeast infections, ringworm. So ringworm is actually a fungal infection. It's not a worm. Athlete's foot, ergot poisoning, destruction of woodlands. They can really be pretty nasty. Let me show you a picture of, this is a big elm tree that was completely destroyed by a fungal infection. This is ergot. So let me go back and show you this. Ergot poisoning. This is really interesting because this fungus, this is called a smut, and it grows on wheat and rye. And this, when you eat this, it actually causes humans to have sort of psychoactive properties. So it mimics, it gives you hallucinations. It can cause you to feel different sensations, hot or cold. And so it's basically a hallucinogen. And so LSD, the hallucinogen, was actually made from ergot. So this was the very first chemical they worked with, and they modified that to make LSD. So the sort of not funny, but very interesting story of this is that the Salem witches, right, in New England, were thought to be women that were poisoned by this fungus because they looked at the weather patterns that existed at the time. They had an especially moist season, wet season, and sort of perfect conditions to grow this ergot. The women would make the bread, right, from this contaminated wheat and give them those hallucinations. And then they were suffering from these hallucinations, but the people didn't understand that. So they thought that they were basically being, they were witches, or they were being, what's the word I'm looking for? Possessed. I was looking for the word possessed. Okay. So that's ergot poisoning. Commercial uses. So commercial uses of fungi are plentiful. We use them for antibiotics. So let's talk about this for a second. So the antibiotics, they kill bacteria. So if we look at number 2 of your commercial uses, let me show you the picture here. So the word antibiotic is drugs that kill bacteria. Okay, not viruses, but just bacteria. So I have in your notes that fungi and bacteria compete with one another for living areas. They're both microbes. They're both are going to live on and inside of organic substances. And so if you have, a piece of bread or something, you're going to have bacteria and fungi competing for that same space. So through evolution, the two have been making chemicals that are sort of kill each other. So the Penicillium mold, as we see here, creates a substance that when it secretes it out into the environment, it kills bacteria. So we use this chemical and we call it penicillin, right? So penicillin was the first antibiotic that was created. This Petri dish, the white line that you see here streaked back and forth, that is Staphylococcus. This is a bacteria. And you can see that where the fungus grew, this penicillium, there's a zone that no bacteria grew. The bacteria could grow up to a point, but no closer to the fungus, because that fungus sprayed, right, or secreted that substance, what we know as penicillin, and it kills the bacteria around it. So bacteria can no longer grow close to that, the mold. So mold has been a source of different antibiotics for us, right? So that's an important medical discovery. And then we have food. So let's take a look at this. Blue cheese, for example, that blue substance inside of that cheese is penicillium, is a fungus. It's called, it is a genus Penicillium. There's Penicillium roqueforti and there's Penicillium glaucum. Both, you know, because Roquefort blue cheese uses this one. They both sort of impart different flavors, but that's what blue cheese is. So if you like blue cheese, it's mold. Sorry to upset you if you didn't know that. Other things you have listed, right? We eat mushrooms themselves, sand shell mushrooms here. We eat them as a food source. We talked about fermentation in class, how yeast are used to ferment alcoholic beverages. Yeast make breads. Yeast make a lot of different things. Yogurt. Not yogurt, I'm sorry, but they make other products. And let's see, cheeses. There are some cheeses that use fungus. I just covered that. Okay. And then these are just some other images of fungi. This is chicken of the woods. Some of them grow like brackets on a tree. This is, again, another puffball. And I think that wraps it up for fungus. Okay, and so there's a last little section here on lichen. So lichen is an organism that is a symbiotic relationship between fungi and algae. So interesting, right? We have a heterotrophic fungi, the fungi hyphy, you can see here. And then we have photosynthetic algae together in a mat called a lichen. So they both help each other. The fungus receives food from photosynthetic algae or the cyanobacteria. So this algae can also be a photosynthetic bacteria. And the fungi, the mycelium, can provide a habitat for the algae to grow and to help it absorb minerals and water. So there's actually a few different kinds of lichen in the world. This is one kind here, and this is another kind here. But lichen, you'll find that out in the forest. If you go for a hike, you'll see lichen. So now that you know it's a symbiotic relationship between fungi and algae or a cyanobacteria, photosynthetic bacteria. Okay, a couple questions before we wrap up. Under a microscope, a piece of mushroom would look most like what? Okay. Hopefully you come up with answer B, tangled string, because that's what the hyphy does, right? Hyphy is like a filamentous, like a stringy-like material with all those hyphae back to back. And so that's what it's going to look like. Fungi are, okay, it should be letter A, heterotrophs. They are not autotrophs. They don't photosynthesize. They are not a type of plant. They have their own kingdom, the kingdom fungi. So they are not in the kingdom protista. This is the only one that makes sense, heterotrophs. All right, and that concludes this lecture.